Research from within Australia and around the world indicates there is a widening gender gap in political preferences amongst Generation Z, the youngest voting generation, with young women shifting towards the political left at a much faster rate than men. So what do these trends mean, not just for our political landscape, but also for our society? To discuss this, we're joined by Dr. Rachel Hogg, a psychology academic with Charles Sturt University. Rachel, thank you for joining us today. Now, we know that young women over the past decade have become significantly more progressive and embraced anti-patriarchal values, while young men are more likely to idealise traditional gender roles. What are the main factors contributing to this growing divide between young men and women?
The million-dollar question. We've seen ideological divides before, but this one is so pronounced that people have described Gen Z not as a single generation, but as actually two different generations. This is a global phenomenon. Typically, young people tend to lean left, and then as they get older, they tend to turn into a more conservative direction. But we are seeing young men now who are expressing more conservative political attitudes than men in their 50s and 60s. Women are swinging left harder than they ever have before. Conceptions of feminism have played a role here. I'm not saying feminism necessarily, but conceptions of feminism. So for misogynists, the uptake of popular feminism has been a call to arms. Female empowerment has been positioned within these misogynistic narratives as a threat to masculinity, a threat to heteronormativity, and we've seen this alt-right men's rights activists. We've got men who identify now as incels or involuntary celibates who really started to see this movement in feminism as a reflection on their masculinity, particularly as a form of emasculation and sexual rejection, the feminizing of society. Women's empowerment is seen as this threat. There's a quote, I think the author is Terry Real. He says, under patriarchy, men can either feel powerful or connected. And I think the current generation of young men aren't feeling much of either of those things. Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist, has tracked the shift in mental health for the Gen Z back to around 2012. So this is not a pandemic-based thing, and he has linked that to social media. So there's a lot of solitariness now for that younger generation, and I think a lot of young men are growing up in the world feeling like they've lost social status.
Is that one of the reasons that personalities like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate are able to have such an influence?
Yeah, look, they are telling men something that has a lot of traction, and that is that you are not the problem, and you are being told that you are the problem, and you need to push back against that as part of this display of masculinity. Men like Tate are telling men that they are under attack, and we've seen a lot of confusion when we talk about patriarchy. As a feminist, I think about that in various different terms, but often when a young man hears the word patriarchy, he doesn't understand that necessarily as a system of harm that's harming both genders. And I think what Peterson has done incredibly well, far better than, unfortunately, a lot of people who are trying to do much more positive things, Peterson has given men this kind of moral crusade that has provided this template, and Tate is similar, for thinking about self-discipline as a pathway to masculinity. And discipline and dominance are two quite connected concepts. Victimhood is not a particularly dominant position, but it's a position that people like Peterson has really capitalized really, really well. And it's telling young men, don't self-reflect, don't look at your own culpability, don't consider how you might change or grow. The problem is not you. This is a narrative that can have cut through, and this victimhood space certainly has some social cachet. And I think it also reflects the fact that in many ways we still often emotionally injure boys as a part of, quotes, turning them into men. We need to stop seeing people like Tate and Peterson as mentors and father figures, but rather start to think about the ways in which they're actually pretty effective businessmen whose product hinges on male vulnerability. And they don't like men. It's not just they don't like women, they also don't like men. And one of the things that always strikes me when I watch Andrew Tate's content is the way he capitalizes on male shame, and self-discipline is positioned as an elixir to that.
How do we then address those ideological differences to create cohesion and cooperation between young men and women and society more broadly?
We are living in incredibly fractured kinds of social realities. You mentioned society. This is not really something that individuals can do single-handedly. This is a collective effort, and it needs to happen at a business level. We are monetizing male insecurity, and this is playing into these narratives that masculinity is being threatened. The discourses that we're in, bridging the gap between those spaces, is something that we absolutely have to do. We can't do that without structural reform, and I think the tech companies need to be looked at. The saying, show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome. There's not a lot of incentive right now for men to be softer, to be more empathic, to be more engaged with feminism. Their masculinity is threatened by doing that within the current paradigm, and I think the way that we shift this is through relationships. What's broken in relationships is usually healed in relationships as well. So I think to break through, first of all, we need to actually listen to men. They're not walking through the world conscious of their privilege. Maybe they should be, but what they are conscious of is the fact that a lot of them are incredibly lonely. A lot of them are struggling to navigate their identities, their careers, and their intimate relationships. They don't feel powerful, even though they have a certain level of power and privilege. If we can get beneath the aggression, often what we find on the other side of that is fear. Relationships are the thing that are going to get us through this, and that sometimes means having really difficult conversations. I don't think there's any easy solutions here, but I think that's the path forward.
Rachel, thank you so much for your time today. I know we have just scratched the surface, but it has been a fascinating conversation, and it will be interesting to see how these trends play out and shape our nation and our world.